Jason, what a privilege it is to have you here on the Rev Rx Podcast, man. You are such an intriguing individual. I love your story, the arc of your career. We'll get into that, but I just want to say thank you for being here.
Yeah, Chad, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Jason, you have, like I mentioned, a unique story. I remember, growing up, ESPN, Sports Center, I mentioned that was my breakfast. That was every day without fail. That was what I was watching from the minute I got up till I had to go to school. You are a senior producer from ESPN for almost 20 years, I believe. And then you kind of switched scripts a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about your background, and then kind of what that looked like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was blessed to work at ESPN for almost 17 years. So you were right in that ballpark there, almost 20 if you want to round it off. But I was grateful, and it's not anything I ever thought I would be able to do. I grew up in a very small town outside of Albany, New York, in upstate New York, capital of New York State. The town's called Ravenna, population 2,000 maybe, and love sports. Grew up in a really close-knit family of two brothers and I who also loved sports, loved each other. I spent a lot of time together. My parents divorced when I was 5, almost 6 years old, and mostly lived with my mom. I had a tough relationship with my dad. He was around, but not present, as I like to say. But my dad also loved sports. So there was you take the good with the bad, right? Like the bad side of it wasn't great, but the good side was he loved sports, and that helped us and catapulted us into loving sports, playing sports, watching sports, all of the things. My grandfather, my dad's dad, Jordan Romano, was a huge part of my life early on. Also loved sports, was one of my coaches, taught me how to be a man, taught me how to drive, like all of the things that my dad wasn't able to do. So my grandfather was a huge part of my life. And I think when I was probably 16 or so, I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete or even a Division I college athlete. I was okay. I played a little bit of community college basketball, but I wasn't very good. I could shoot a little bit, but I loved to talk about sports and watch it and keep notebooks with stats and fight my brother for the sports page in the morning when we would want to see who won last night and read the box scores. That was a real thing that we did growing up. And I thought the next best thing, if I can't play, is to talk about sports or to work in sports. So that's what I went to college for, to be in sports broadcasting. And, initially when I got out of college, I worked at a local radio station up in Albany to begin my broadcasting career. And it was a news talk station, which didn't cover a lot of sports. It was mostly politics and, local issues around the area. They talked to some celebrities and had some fun interviews too. It was kind of a morning zoo radio show, but, we didn't do a lot of sports. And so I just asked for any little sports, experience that I could get, whether it was to go cover a local, minor league hockey game or minor league baseball game, or even talk about the scores from the games on the radio show, which is what I would do. I said, let me do the scores. And so I got to do the scores. And technically that's my first iteration into sports radio or broadcasting outside of college. But then I saw a job open on ESPN, working at ESPN radio on the internet in the early days of the internet, like 1998, 1999. And I applied kind of on a whim. Like there's no way they would ever call me, but why not apply? And I did, and they called, and that was great because the first time I did and they called, I went out there and interviewed, didn't get the job. Actually, I wasn't qualified and they just weren't ready to hire me. This would have been 1998. But in 2000, the same job opened up again, and I applied for it again. It was ESPN radio full-time producer for the radio network, the national network in Bristol, Connecticut, where the headquarters of ESPN was and still is. And so I applied in 2000. They called me again. I went out and I interviewed again, and I could tell this time it was a little different. And it came down to me and one other person. And they don't do this, at least in the time I was there, too often, but they decided they wanted to hire both of us. So Paul and myself, I'll never forget Paul's name. I actually just saw him recently at the Super Bowl. Paul and I both were hired on the same day, July 18th of 2000. We both got a job at ESPN Radio as a producer. And it started my career working for the worldwide leader for 17 years.
And that's a lot of sports guys' dream job, in case you're not a sports guy out there.
But I tell Chad, people it was a dream job, but it wasn't because I didn't allow myself to dream that big. Like for me, if I had gotten the local sports anchor job in Albany, New York for WNYT Channel 13, an NBC affiliate, that would have been the dream job. Like to do sports every day for 3 or 4 minutes as a TV broadcaster would have been incredible. But I wasn't dreaming big enough because when ESPN came calling, obviously that's the worldwide leader. That was the place, like you, that I woke up and spent many mornings watching SportsCenter and many evenings watching the Big Show with, Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick. Like that was my go-to broadcast place if I could ever have picked one. I just didn't think I could ever get there. So it wasn't really a dream. And then it happened,
That's right.
which is kind of crazy.
And if you're out there and you don't know about those morning sports pages, maybe you're not old enough. Those were gold.
Valuable to every level. I mean, it was the Albany Times-Union for me, Chad. I don't talk about this, Ted, often, but it was the Albany Times-Union. My mom subscribed to the newspaper. Every morning it would come, and my brother Chris and I would fight over who would get the sports page first. Not fight, like legitimately start throwing punches, but we would argue. It was usually whoever was first to get there. And then if I got there a little late, I would grab the entertainment section, something that I was more interested in, the movie section. Mm-hmm. But the sports section was gold, like you said, especially the box scores, because there was no internet growing up for me. So I didn't know who won the games the night before. I might turn on ESPN, but if I didn't have time, I wanted to read the box scores and see who scored the most points and what the score was and what the other teams were doing. That's how I got my information when I was growing up.
And, standings of your favorite team.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Even like league leaders and home runs or
so Chad,
points or whatever.
I had it before there was fantasy sports. They had something what we called rotisserie baseball. And that was an actual game that you could play in the late 80s and early 90s. But we started our own fantasy rotisserie is what we called it. Baseball league with 4 people in my hometown, Michael Nieves, my brother Chris, myself, and somebody else. I can't think of who it was now. But 4 of us played fantasy sports. We did our own draft. It was baseball. We did our own draft. Every single Sunday, the newspaper would come with the full stats of every player. Like you said, the standings and stats. And then we would write up in our notebooks each week who was winning based upon the stats of the players. Because we couldn't keep it every day and you couldn't substitute a guy in and out and play the way fantasy sports is done now. But every single week, and we would make trades with each other. We would do a waiver wire where we'd have to contact each other to make sure it was legal. But for the most part, we did a draft and that was our team. And we would use the newspaper every Sunday to update who was leading in the statistics.
That's pretty cool.
It's hilarious. Yeah, to think about, because this was 1990 when I was in high school. And, when fantasy sports became a real big thing, it was probably the mid to late 90s when the internet came around. And I kept telling people, I've been doing this since I was in high school. And they said, how? How are you doing this? I said, manually. We were keeping notebooks and writing things in pen and paper and pencil and using the newspapers to help us with our team. It's pretty crazy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Fantasy football before fantasy football was cool, or baseball.
Yeah, I should have invested in it before it was popular. I would probably be a millionaire right now.
Cutting edge.
That's right.
You've always been kind of a pioneer, I guess.
Sure, on some level, I guess. That's right.
Well, thinking about your time at ESPN, you were rubbing shoulders with a lot of the world's greatest athletes, a lot of the elite athletes, a lot of the better named people. And from my understanding, you still have a lot of relationships with a few of those. What kind of lessons did you learn? And I know that's kind of a loaded question, but maybe 1 or 2 from the time you spent with some of these athletes. Not a lot of people really get to rub shoulders the way that you did. And I think in our world today, we kind of elevate some of these athletes to even idol status for some kids growing up, that kind of thing. But what were some lessons you learned from some of these guys and girls?
It's a really great question. Not to plug my book, because I'm not here to plug it. I told you beforehand, we didn't have to talk about it. But that's actually the second book, is the Uniform of Leadership Lessons Learned of True Success from My ESPN Life. And it's the stories and many of the different people that I've encountered along with, the famous people, but also some not so famous people that just were amazing leaders at ESPN. But I think I'll give you a couple of sort of overarching generic lessons, because the first thing I'll say is if you treat athletes like people and not celebrities or put them on a pedestal, they're more likely to be, normal people back to you. It's weird when an athlete walks in and you see a fan around them, you're the greatest. Oh my gosh. They almost become guarded in some ways and, almost embarrassed. Like, oh, I don't want to be put on a pedestal, even though they understand the scenario. The Super Bowl recently in San Francisco, and we're on something called Radio Row, and it's literally chaos with all these radio stations, but all these athletes are kind of walking through and they're looked at like these commodities, like these celebrities, like these, these idols, if you will. And listen, I can't judge it because I was that kid who loved those athletes. Like Daryl
Right.
Strawberry, who's one of my friends now, was my hero when I was 11 years old, and his poster was on my wall. Larry Bird, I got a picture of him right behind me here
Hmm.
in my office. That was my favorite athlete growing up. If I ever met Larry Bird, which I haven't, I'd probably be like that fan that I'm describing not to be. But these guys are human, is I guess the point. Took ESPN for me to get that. Now I work with a lot of pro athletes in ministry, and I see them even more human than I did when I was at ESPN. But they're humans. They're people. They make a lot of money. They're on a lot of, big platforms, and a lot of people root for them and wear their jerseys and ask for autographs. But when it comes down to the core of who they are, they're people. And I remember this with Brian Dawkins, because Brian Dawkins was a Pro Football Hall of Famer with the Philadelphia Eagles. I am a Dallas Cowboys fan from way back in the 70s and 80s. And I was working with this guy saying to him, I hated you as a player because you were on the wrong team, bro.
Right.
And then I met him. He's a follower of Jesus. So am I. We start talking. We start connecting. We realize, he's a great dude. I hope he sees me as a good person too. Not that it matters, but we just hit it off and became friendly. And I realized that's a human being who struggles with mental stuff. He's shared that publicly, so I'm not outing him or anything. Who loves his wife, who loves his kids, who loves Jesus. I mean, loves the Lord. And he's so passionate about his faith and walking with Christ. That humanizes him. And suddenly all the barriers are gone when it comes to trying to look at him differently. And it's happened. Listen, when you're at ESPN and these people just walk through the halls and you see a LeBron James or you see a Kobe Bryant, or you see somebody, Derek Jeter. For me, I remember it was David Wright came through as a Mets fan. And it's like, okay, that's David Wright. That's Derek Jeter. That's
legend.
LeBron James.
Yeah.
But when you actually work with these guys on a daily basis and talk to them, and your coworkers with them, but you also realize they're just human beings. They want to be treated normal. They really do. Now, they're not going to turn down when somebody kind of gives them this or gives them that, because they do get a lot of things handed to them. But when it comes down to it, they're humans. So that's a big lesson I learned. The other one is, and this is biblical, whatever you do, work heartily as though you're working for the Lord and not for man. I think that's Colossians 3. So the idea of doing good work is biblical. And I had to learn that because there were times where I didn't do good work. And I don't believe I was representing the Lord as best as I should. And I think when I realized that my work could be worship to God, also worship, or I shouldn't say worship, honoring, I guess, the people that I worked with, I think I elevated my work and realized, okay, it's 100%, man. Give it every single day. And don't just do it for pats on the back or for notoriety or for a raise or more money or to climb some kind of corporate ladder. Do it because you love the Lord.
Yes.
And that's a huge lesson that I learned. It probably took a little while. That was more later in my years at ESPN. But I think that's a huge lesson that I would share with anybody is, man, remember when you're there, that's not the end. That's actually the beginning. And you want to work really hard and do the best work that you can, whatever you're doing. I remember talking to a young person, this is where I'll close on this answer. I remember talking to a production assistant who had just gotten hired out of college, and they were maybe 6 months into their role. And, they were doing the teleprompter for like ESPN News night content and broadcast. Not a lot of people watch it. It's kind of where they put the beginning stages of working in production. And I remember talking to this person and they were like, man, I just want to I want to be an associate producer. That's the next step up, right? I want to be promoted to that. I want to go on this show. I want to work on this. I want to be a camera operator. And I said, that's all great. It's awesome to have, goals and try to reach those goals and where you want to go. But are you doing the job that you're doing right now really, really well? Like, do people see you as the best teleprompter at ESPN? Because if they don't, then you're not ready to make a leap and go and be promoted because you're not great at where you are. Somebody called it bloom where you're planted, right? And that's not just where you are in terms of what you're doing for your work, but it's the work that you're actually doing. Are you doing it well? Because why would I take a chance on giving you a promotion, Chad, if I don't think you're doing the job that you're currently in pretty well? Because that happened to me. I was not doing my job well as a talent producer. expecting for me to become an actual producer. And I didn't get the job. You know, want to know why? Because I wasn't doing well in the job that I was in. And that taught me a lesson that I tried to pass on to young people. Like, just be great at what you do, even if it's the smallest thing. If you go get coffee for your boss every day, make sure that coffee is perfect. It might be a tedious task, but people are watching. And not only are people watching, but the Lord is watching as well.
There's so much there that I think is extremely important to talk about. Appreciate you sharing that, and particularly that part about whatever you do it well.
Do it well.
I'm reminded that, a lot of times, and I'm one of the things I do too is I coach men, and kind of show them how to integrate faith as part of everything that they do. A lot of times we see our job or our career as separate than our faith. Our faith is something sacred, and everything else seems secular. We try to pillarize our lives in a way, but bringing all of that together is what you're explaining here, and doing everything you do, working, eating, drinking, whatever you're doing, for the glory of God. And a lot of times, that doesn't mean you have to like your job.
No,
I've
it doesn't.
talked to guys that are like, I don't like what I do. Okay, well, that's not a prerequisite for doing
But
it
you can
well.
still be great at what you do. If you don't like it, you can still do it. Work
That's
hard.
right. Yeah.
Totally.
And for a large part of my life, I remember thinking, and I was never really taught this, but I remember thinking, man, I wish we didn't have to work.
There are days I wish that too, Chad. There are days I wish that too.
They fell in the garden, and now we work. Well, no, work was part of God's original plan.
Mm-hmm.
When God created Adam, he gave him a garden to tend and to work. Work got a lot harder as a result of the fall. That's where we get the briars, and the ground was hard and all of this. But working is part of God's purpose for us, and working well, I think, is just part of what it means to be a Christian, to do it for the Lord. And so, a lot of times we're grumpy because we don't like where we are. And can I just say that the world doesn't need more grumpy Christians? If you're a follower of Jesus, man, you should be the best at what you do, and you should do it with a smile on your face.
Well, let me throw this out too, Chad, and this is maybe a little off center, but we're probably gonna dive into this area, but if as followers of Jesus, like, we're representing Christ wherever we go, right? And what you talked about in terms of being a follower of Jesus everywhere you go, especially in the workplace, like, that's a passionate topic for me. And representing Christ well. It's actually the first thing I ever spoke about probably 12 years ago when I was still at ESPN. Somebody asked me to come speak to their men's group locally here in Connecticut, and I'd never spoken anywhere. Like, that wasn't a thing I was like trying to do. I was just trying to do my job and do it well. But he said, "Can you talk about being a follower of Jesus in the workplace?" And the more I started reading scripture, the more I started understanding it's really about being a follower of Jesus everywhere you go. It's not just the workplace. Matthew 6, seek first the kingdom of God and everything else. Christ has to be at the center wherever you go. But I just saw an example recently, and I'm not going to name the name, but I saw this guy, and this is an experience too. This is where it's really hard and somewhat complicated for the work that I do now with Sports Spectrum, because we highlight athletes who are followers of Christ or coaches who are followers of Christ. And yet sometimes, just like you and I, they're flawed humans who mess up. And I saw a guy who talked openly from the Seahawks about following Jesus. He was so good last week, in the questions that we asked him. He openly talked about how he gave his life to Christ. He said this in the locker room during a win this year with Seattle. And then I saw him at the parade recently. And at the parade, he goes, "You're going to say this about our team. You're going to say this about our O-line. Well, bleep you." And he said it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I just put my hand in my head like, this guy needs some discipling.
Cringe. Yeah.
I cringed, because how in the world could that come out of an overflow of following Jesus? I could never. It's funny. I mean, I might say to someone like, quietly, like, "See, this is what you get for calling us out." But I could never use language like that. I could never, on a stage, knowing there's hundreds of thousands of people and certainly children, ever even think about saying that. And it's glorified now. If you go on social media, you could see it. I recommend you don't, but you could see it, and there's people touting them up and laughing and dapping them up and thinking it's all great. But how are you representing Christ everywhere you go? That's what I'm trying to get at. And it's so vital that there's, an example that we're trying to be. And I first of all, let me say this. I didn't get this right away when I was at ESPN. It took me about a decade.
Right.
But I recognized that when I go into work every day, I didn't want to be the guy that was cursing up a storm. I didn't want to be, even if I was at home, which I'm not, but if I was, I just didn't want them to see, if they're going to see Jesus through me. Well, if I'm start cursing and just acting the same way that, that the world acts, there's no way that they could see Jesus in me. They see the world. And what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul, right? And so how am I going to represent Christ? That was so vital to me. And I just think we have to be mindful of that as followers of Jesus. I hope the people who are listening recognize that. And I think most examples are. There are people who represent Christ really well, but there's few that are not. And you got to be mindful if you start proclaiming Jesus and then you start acting like a fool right after it. It's not a great look, but it's also not a great representation if you're trying to make disciples or, even remotely have a chance to talk about your faith with someone.
Right. And not picking on anybody, but that's a good example. And I see that a lot in our world today. To be honest, I used to be a little bit like that too.
Of course, we all have.
I call myself a hypocrite for the first however many years I was a Christian because I didn't get it. This is the way I describe it now. I wanted enough of Jesus to get into heaven, but not so much that it really changed the way that I look.
Bingo. Yeah.
And, so I would be that person when I graduated pharmacy school. I'd be in my corner drugstore and it would be so stressful because people just are that way. And I remember, man, I'd be flinging words that would make a lot of people blush. And I would just contribute it to, well, it's just a stressful environment.
Right. You justify it.
I wouldn't talk like that everywhere I go. But if I'm going to talk like that anywhere I go, that's not glorifying God, and that's not, it's not attractive. Is what I'm trying to say.
Well, there's this aroma of Christ that the Bible talks about, right? And it also talks about let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. Now, it doesn't say in Scripture, don't say this word, and this word, because that's a cuss word,
right?
Obviously. But we know what's wholesome and what isn't. We know what's uplifting and what's not. We know what sounds like the world and what sounds like Jesus. So we know. And if we go on the route that also many of us have, that's what's going to sound like. We're going to sound like everybody else. I had a potty mouth for years. I cursed a lot. I don't curse much anymore, if at all. And the Lord has delivered me from that. Now I'm careful not to judge people who do.
Yeah, right.
But I always say what's coming out of the heart. And if you're just going to drop F-bombs and start telling people bleep you, because they offended you or whatever, then I think that's a heart issue. That's clearly, the Lord's got to still do some work on.
Exactly. And we're not passing judgment here, but we're making a point that everywhere you go, people are looking at you. And if you proclaim the name of Christ, they're looking at you differently.
That's right.
And in order to make disciples, which is our call, go and make disciples in all the world. If we're going to be doing that, then we've got to pay attention to how we look in all aspects of life, including our workplace. And you mentioned, faith in the workplace.
Mm.
And I love the way you said it. It was so simple. It's like, well, it's just basically bringing faith everywhere you go.
Yeah.
It's not a separate place, and it shouldn't be segregated. Just letting him be the center of our life, through which all else flows.
I've said in my life for many years, Jesus was a piece of my life.
Yes.
But it's when he became the centerpiece that things changed, because then I went into the workplace. I went to the grocery store. I got on an airplane. I went to my in-laws. Wherever I went, I was a follower of Christ first. And I had to understand that, because identity is a big topic that we talk about with Sports Spectrum. And my identity was rooted in being at ESPN. And so if you asked me who I was, I would have said I'm an ESPN producer. I'm also a husband and a dad and a follower of Jesus. And it's when you do that little bit of a quarter shift, as the great Bob Goff says, a quarter shift to the right, and you understand, no, wait, I'm a follower of Jesus who happens to be an ESPN producer, who happens to be a husband and a dad, a friend, a brother, all the things, a son. That is when things start to shift, because everything comes from the outflow of Christ, not from the outflow of Jason. And that's a prayer I pray every day. Lord, help me to be obedient to you and not selfish.
Yeah.
Because that's, to me, is the opposite of obedience, is selfishness. And it's when I get into the selfish nature of myself that I start sounding like the world. And when I'm obedient, it's when hopefully I'm reflecting Jesus in the best way that I can. Now, again, you said don't judge, and we're not here to judge. But if you claim to be a follower of Christ, and then you go out and act a fool, you are asking for judgment. I'm
You are.
sorry. Not judgment in the way that you're going to be condemned.
Yeah.
But judgment like, hey, bro, like
that doesn't line up.
That doesn't line up. What's going on here? And I think there's a level, I should say, of where we don't have to judge per se and say you're a terrible human, but we can be accountable. Let's be seeking accountability, because that's the only way I think that we can grow and get better as followers of Christ.
I agree. And it comes down to fruit, doesn't it? Jesus says you recognize the tree by the fruit.
Love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, faithfulness, self-control. Like, that's the fruit of the Spirit. If we don't have that, there's probably something going on that's not right.
Yeah, and when you see someone where the tree is pronouncing itself, to continue this analogy, the tree is pronouncing itself as a follower of Christ, but then you've got what happened in the parade. That fruit looks rotten.
It's a rotten fruit. And it's funny, Matt Forte, who's my co-host on Sports Spectrum, the Chicago Bears running back, he might as well be a pastor, but he said just recently on the show, he's like, rotten fruit tries to eat itself. But if it's good fruit, right, that you can eat, it's not going to try and eat itself. And I didn't understand quite what he meant, but I think what he meant is if the fruit that you're displaying is of Christ, it's going to be attractive. If the fruit if you're displaying the fruit of the world and it's kind of gross and yucky, you're just going to keep feeding off that. And I just thought that was very wise on his part to say that, and a great reminder as we talk about this.
Yeah. I'm going to reiterate what you said because I love it so much. You shouldn't be a fill in the blank, whatever your career is, who happens to be a Christian. The goal with this Christian life is to be a Christian who happens to be a whatever your career is.
Seek first the kingdom.
Shift, and I think we've got to get that right.
Seek first the kingdom, man.
Lord help us.
Yes, God, come, Jesus, come. Right, Chad?
And I'll even say one more thing before we pass this topic. I love talking to you about this, but one of the things that I tell my young adults is this: we lose a lot of people, and you and I are kind of ministering to the same people. We lose a lot of people after they graduate from youth group. They start making their own decisions. They're adults now, some more than others, but they're able to say, all right, I can decide if I go to church or not. I don't have to go because mom said I had to go. And there becomes this crisis in their faith too, where they need to believe what they believe because they believe it and not just because that's what they grew up believing. Some of that happens in this age group, but I'm convinced that one of the biggest reasons we lose people in that age group is because they're surrounded by people for whom Jesus has not made a big difference in their life. People who do claim the name of Jesus, but then they go around and they have the fruit of the world, and they're going to, you can't blame them, because it's like, all right, well, you know what, if I'm going to devote my Sundays and my Wednesdays or my Thursdays or whatever that looks like, and I'm going to give the church my money and 10% of my tithe and all of this stuff, and they don't look any different than anybody else, what's the point?
Right.
And that's that
a struggle
part. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a struggle, because I always say, who are you? Show me your 4 closest friends and I'll show you, who you are. And if they're all non-believers, or they're all acting like an idiot, or they're all living a worldly life, that's going to be the direction you're going to probably be pulled towards and steered towards. And that's not the place to be. But yeah, it's funny. As an older adult now in my 50s, I could see these 22-year-olds and I see the struggles, and like, you have no idea what I've been going through. And I'm like, I hate to say this, but I know exactly what you're going through. Nothing's changed other than it's, 20 or 30 years later, but it's the same struggles, the same pulls, the same, temptations, the same desires and dreams. It's the same. It just is. And hopefully there's some wisdom that I can impart on them. But yeah,
that's what I love about the Word of God. Is the context was different, the times were different, but the issues were not.
It's still the same.
It's still the same.
It really is. It's crazy.
So ESPN, you've got the job. You're doing your best. You're working at it with all your heart. There comes a time where you realize that your life needs to take a different shape, a different direction. Can you tell us about that transition and to now what is Sports Spectrum, sports ministry, I think is maybe the term that I've seen there. Talk us through that transition for you, and kind of what were some of the big moments that you remember?
Yeah, I'll go real key here, or real short on this part in terms of background, but I grew up Catholic, didn't really follow Jesus, I just kind of went and did the check boxes and kind of walked away from faith, not intentionally, just didn't really care, into my teens and 20s. Got the job at ESPN, still was not a follower of Christ. Mother's Day 2001, my brother Chris leads me to Jesus. Again, that's a whole nother story. Maybe another time we can flesh that out. So I began my walk with Christ in 2001. I was 27 years old. So had lived a good portion of my life without knowing Christ and started to grow and learn about who Jesus was. Now, again, had that identity conflict, if you will, or crisis of understanding that Christ needed to be all of my life, but he definitely wasn't early on. And then somewhere around 10 years into ESPN, I started to get the idea of follower of Jesus who happens to be what we just talked about. So then I'm really growing in my faith, right? And I'm getting more involved in my church. I'm serving, I'm leading a small group. My pastor at the time, my late pastor, Pastor Joe, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he's one of my great mentors. And he's like, hey, I see something in you. I think you should join the elder board at my church. And I'm, 40 years old, not even 40 at the time, I think 39. And I thought, you're nuts. You want this misfit joining the elder board at a church? Are you crazy? But apparently all the other elders were unanimous in wanting to bring me on. So I said, all right, God, if this is what you want, I'm going to say yes to it. And I just started saying yes to all the God doors that started opening. So I got more involved at my church, started speaking a little bit, even preached my first sermon on a Sunday morning. I was scared to death. But as that's happening, I'm also feeling this, I don't know what this nudge or this pull or the Holy Spirit saying, your time's going to be up at ESPN soon. And in 2015, I spoke at or I was invited to speak at a social media gathering of church leaders and people who worked in churches, prophets, faith-based organizations. And I was the only one who worked at a secular company who was there. There's about 80 of us. And I was doing social media at ESPN. That was my job, social media producer. But I remember being around these people that weekend and thinking, wow, there's people doing exactly what I'm doing right now, but for what I see as a greater purpose. Like they're working in ministry. So they're working to share the gospel with the work that they do. And I'm just working to share sports, okay. And I love sports, but like, is it really like purposeful work? No, it's not, in my opinion. And I loved my church work. So that was really intriguing. And then in 2016, which was my last full year at ESPN, I landed on a show called Mike and Mike in the Morning. And it was my second stint on that show. And I loved working on that show and being on and working early mornings and being on a show where I was very visible and the show was very visible. But I still felt this weird nudge like, Jason, your time is coming up here. Don't know where it's going to be yet. Just hang in there. But I think you're going to be going and doing something else. And I could sense it was like wanting to do more for the Lord. That's what I felt like I wanted to do. And then I met my boss, Steve Stenstrom. And Steve was and is the president of Pro Athletes Outreach, which is a Christian sports ministry for professional athletes, and invited me to one of his conferences. And I was blown away. See all these very famous athletes praising Jesus and bringing their wives and kind of getting tutored and mentored and discipled in the Word of God. And I'm like, this is my world, sports and Jesus. This is amazing. And then they acquired Sports Spectrum, which had been a sports and faith media company for 30 plus years at that time. And he acquired Sports Spectrum to steward it into the next iteration. And that's when he and I started talking. And he's like, I think you could come and help us start this thing and run this thing, do a podcast, all the things with Sports Spectrum. What do you think? And I was praying about it quite a bit. My wife and I prayed about it. And when they made the offer, it was 60 or 40%, less than I was making at ESPN. That's a big pay cut to say yes to. But I don't know. I felt at peace about it. And I promised my wife, I said, listen, if this is not from the Lord, it'll probably blow up in our faces and I'll go back to ESPN or find another job in the business. But if it is from God, he's going to make a way and he's going to see it through. And, it's going to work out because it's God's doing, not mine. And literally yesterday, as we record this, was my last day at ESPN 9 years ago, yesterday. So this is all very familiar because I was thinking about this anniversary of my last day at ESPN. And then 3 days later, I started work at Sports Spectrum 3 or 4 days later, right after Valentine's Day, as we record this. So it wasn't an easy move. What was good was it took me about 8 months and I started to see God's doing, and because you never know the Lord's plan for you until you look back and see kind of all the different roads that he puts you on. And that's when I started to see, like, yeah, God, I think this was the right move and you had me here for a purpose. And now it's been 9 years and I'm still here. So clearly the Lord is in this. He's made a way. It's just been an incredible, incredible ride working in sports ministry, but also in media and being able to go and cover Super Bowls and cover big events, Final Fours, and ask some of the greatest athletes in the world about their faith in Jesus. But to leave ESPN, no, now 9 years later, I moved on obviously from that. But at the time, it was an incredibly, incredibly hard decision, but one that I really took a leap of faith for. Like
Yeah.
I was trusting God that he was the one directing this, not me, because it didn't make sense to walk away from a very cushiony job and all the benefits that come with working at ESPN and Disney and suddenly going into a very tiny, small ministry and starting over in essence at 42 years old. But I just knew the Lord was leading me and I tried to be obedient.
I relate to that so much, and I'm convinced that someone listening to this today needs to hear that. I'm reminded of the song. I assume it's a well-known song down here in the Bible Belt, so it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Little is much when God is in it.
Yeah.
And yeah, just the road that God takes us down is usually not the road that we would choose for ourselves, but it's far better than anything we could come up with.
Oh my gosh, so much better, Chad.
Yeah.
I mean, if you told me when I was 19 in college that I'd be, able to host a sports show for 8 years, almost 9 years, and to be a part of a sports show like I am now with one of the great Chicago Bears players of all time, I would have said, "Yep, sign me up." And then I would have thrown in, "But you're going to be talking about Jesus with these athletes." I would have laughed at you. I said, "No, no stinking way would I ever do that. What is wrong with you, young Jason?" But this is so much better than I could have ever imagined. People ask me all the time, "Would you want to go back to ESPN?" Even recently at the Super Bowl, they would say, Do you miss this, the ESPN part?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I miss the resources and I miss, some of the people who, relationships are everything, right? I miss some of the people, but I don't miss working at ESPN. I've moved on from that. And I'm almost a decade now being in sports ministry. And I just would never go back, I don't think, to a place like that. Not because there's anything bad or, any morals or beliefs or politics or it's not any of that. It's just that I love the Lord so much that the work I get to do, I would never want to not do it. I would always want to be able to ask people about Jesus. And if I went to ESPN again, there's no way I'd be able to do that. So I just love the work that I get to do and I miss the friendships and I'm glad. I probably wouldn't be on a podcast with you if I hadn't worked at ESPN. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
But I loved my time there, but I've moved on and I love my time now. I can't believe it's almost been a decade working with Sports Spectrum. And to think where we're not even close to where I think we can go with this, but we're all going and stewarding it at the proper pace that the Lord wants it to be. And when he continues to do things that blow us away, we just give him all the glory. He did this recently at the Super Bowl. Like we reached, I think it was 7.6 million views on all of our stuff in one week. We got to ask some of the great players about Jesus. We created over 200 pieces of content, which is just mind blowing in a week. But I give God all the glory for that. Like, because this has been a work in progress for 8 years to get to where we are now. So
yeah, it's a long game with the Lord.
It really is.
He doesn't work in our time. But we can trust him. We can trust him. That's right.
Totally.
And every career move I've made, Jason, I've taken a hit in salary, but I've gained far more than what I lost because it created a better environment for me to do ministry.
Totally.
I couldn't do it with the other positions. And so,
Chad, let me just say this real quick. 9 years later, I still do not make what I made at ESPN when I left.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm not saying that for any reason other than it's not about the money, but I've never been more happy. We just got done paying for our daughter's college. We were able to put her through college and pay for it debt free. Man. Like the Lord has taken care of me and my family in an amazing way. And I don't know how, other than he's God and I'm not, because I don't make what I made when I left ESPN, but it's not about the money. It's just about being faithful and being obedient and watching God do what he does best and showing off. And he's the one, not me.
Praise the Lord. That's called God math.
That's right. They don't teach you that in high school.
No, we give them what we have, and it's always enough. And
That's right.
you, my friend, are an inspiration. You're doing great work, and I'm so glad our paths have crossed. And I just wonder, with one last closing question, if there's somebody out there that's struggling, they're trying their best to follow Jesus, but they're just kind of overwhelmed with life in the middle of the carpools, in the middle of the work deadlines, the everyday life. Uh, what would be your advice to them about bringing faith into the very aspect of who they are?
Yeah, I think it's in those moments that you pivot. And I think of Peter and I think of Judas, right? And like they both betrayed Jesus pretty badly right before Jesus went to the cross.
Mm-hmm.
But Peter ran towards Jesus. Judas did not. And we know
Yeah.
how that ended. And I think when you're going through tough times, run to Jesus. I believe that. And, it sounds easy, right? It's so simple. Just run to Jesus. And I get like why life is hard and things happen. And trust me, I've been through my own battles as we all have. Every, one of us have, where we've had loss of family members and we've had struggles and, temptations and all these things. Run to Jesus. I think that's a song too.
It is.
Pretty good song that I like listening to, but run to him. And it says run, not walk, like run to Jesus. I believe that like the quicker you go towards him, the quicker you're going to kind of enter into a place that provides you that rest and that peace. And then surround yourself with people who, we talked about this earlier, about the people that you're closest with in your circle. Man, find some Jesus loving people to talk to walk through the difficult times with. I see this with a lot of young adults. When they're going through things, they isolate and they don't bother to call. They kind of stay home, and then they'll come back 2-3 months later and be like, I'm really struggling. And I'm like, well, what were you doing in the middle of that struggle? I was staying home and, staying in bed or playing video games or not. I'm like, you got to reach out. You got to reach out. And so if you're struggling, run to Jesus, but then run to people who love Jesus. And that's the best advice I can give. And I'm not saying it's going to always get better or it's going to be perfect. Job's family was not given back to him when he ran to the Lord, but he was content and he found peace and he was able to walk through the valleys of the shadows of death. And that's what I believe the Lord does when we're going through things, is he allows us, this opportunity to pursue him and to run towards him, and then to have people walk alongside with us to help us through it. And there's usually an end sight when you walk through it with people who follow Christ. And if there's not, the end sight ultimately is him when we all leave this earth anyways. So that's going to be way better than anything here on this earth.
Yep.
So keep walking towards Jesus or running towards Jesus, and then run towards the people who follow Jesus. I believe that's the best answer I can give.
So good. So good. We weren't made to do this alone.
Gosh, no.
We need the Lord, and his presence goes with us wherever we are. And he has a way of lightening the load even when the load isn't even less. It feels
So
less
true.
when he's with us. And
Chad, let me just give you one more example too, because this is a personal example. At the Super Bowl recently, I was feeling a heavy weight, kind of mind, what would you call it? Mental battle, I guess, with myself, because we had a couple partnerships and sponsors for that week of our Super Bowl that I wanted to make sure we were going to deliver for them. And I felt a heavy weight and pressure to be the one responsible if we did or didn't deliver. And my coworker, John, who's been with me almost 9 years with Sports Spectrum, real godly guy, always makes time for the Lord. And he just stopped. He goes, you know what we need to do? We just need to pray right now. Because I was talking out loud and processing the weight of what I was feeling. And it was middle of the week. And he just said, you know what, we just need to pray right now. And we did, right at Super Bowl Media Row. The three of us or so, we just got in a circle and we prayed, God, you take the lead on this, not me. And we ran towards Christ, even in that moment. And so that's an example of, I was kind of going through it a little bit mentally. And he saw that and he's like, let's run this race together. You're not alone, but let's also seek first the kingdom and let's get to Jesus and pray to him and not just try to start our day and go to work and handle the business that was going to come our way. So I felt it myself just recently. And that's why I say that run to Christ and run to people who love Christ, because that's what's going to get you through any situation, I believe.
the enemy wants to isolate us and make us feel like we're the only one going through that. But surround yourself with people who love Jesus. Surround yourself with people who will pray with you and pray for you.
Yes.
And take it to the Lord together. There's something
Amen.
about that nothing else can replace.
It's a game changer, Chad. And for those listening, it is a game changer if you can do that.
Jason, where can my audience find out more about you? I know you've got a website, you got some books I want you guys to check out. Of course, I'll put links, but
Yeah.
where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, if they want to reach me, social media is usually the easiest place. They can go on my Twitter X page, or Instagram is where I'm probably most frequent. But my website, I haven't really updated it too much, but it's there, jasonromano.com. You can reach me through that as well. And certainly, if you have any interest in seeing any of the work I've done, it's there too. But yeah, in my books, we mentioned Uniform of Leadership earlier. My other book, Live to Forgive. We should do a second episode just on forgiveness, because that one, that's a deep topic about the relationship I have with my dad. But that book and Uniform of Leadership are available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And I'd be honored if anybody read it, because we were talking about writing books before we started, and it's the two hardest things I've ever done was write the first book and then write a second book. Forget any of this broadcasting and producing. That stuff is easy in my eyes compared to writing books. But I'm glad I wrote them. And, I haven't written a book in 5 years, and I don't plan on writing anymore. I'll do whatever God wants me to, but I don't want to write any more books because it's too hard to write. But those two books I'm very proud of. And I think there's a lot of practical, helpful tools hopefully for people that are struggling and going through things.
And then, of course, we got Sports Spectrum as well.
Of course. How can we forget that?
Podcast. You've got magazine, all kinds of great media on there.
Yeah,
so
that website, just because my boss will kill me if I don't mention it, is sportspectrum.com. And that's just the place to go. And you can subscribe to our magazine. You can listen to our podcasts everywhere podcasts are found. All of our Super Bowl content and all of our football content, because we do have a football player hosting the show I work on with. That's all available on our YouTube channel, and just search Sports Spectrum.
We'll put links to all that as well so you don't get in trouble. So you got to keep you in good grace.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Chad.
Jason, man, what a privilege. This has been an honor. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for lending your voice to the show. And you guys watch out. Episode 2 might be coming around before too long. So
I'm down for it. Let's do it.
Sounds good, Jason. Take care, bud.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for having me.